I still remember the exact words. Clean out your desk. You're done here. 18 years. That was all my loyalty was worth. I stood there holding a cardboard box, while people I'd worked beside for nearly 2 decades suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. My boss didn't even bother walking me out. He just turned around, closed his office door, and moved on with his day. What he didn't know was that less than 3 weeks later, he'd be sitting across a polished conference table, asking me for something only I could give him. And that's when he finally learned who I really was. My name is Arthur Vale, and until last year, I believed hard work always spoke for itself. I wasn't the loudest guy in the office. I wasn't the one who stayed late just so people would notice. I wasn't interested in office politics, golf outings with executives, or pretending every new corporate initiative was the greatest idea anyone had ever come up with. I just did my job. Apparently, that wasn't enough anymore. I started at Harrison Industrial Systems when I was 27 years old. Back then, the company was much smaller. We built automation equipment for manufacturing plants across the Midwest. I came in as a junior field technician, crawling under conveyor belts, troubleshooting electrical cabinets, and driving thousands of miles every year to customer sites. It wasn't glamorous. Some days I spent 12 hours inside noisy factories where the air smelled like machine oil and hot steel. But I loved solving problems. Customers trusted me because I never pretended to know something I didn't. If I couldn't fix it immediately, I'd stay until I figured it out. Over the years, promotions came naturally. Field technician became senior technician. Senior technician became project supervisor. Eventually, I led one of the company's most profitable implementation teams. Not because I chased titles, because people kept asking for me by name. Whenever a major customer had a complicated installation, someone in sales would usually say the same thing. Send Arthur. He'll figure it out. I wasn't perfect. I made mistakes like everyone else, but I owned them. That built trust. Some of my coworkers had become genuine friends over the years. Mike from engineering, Linda in purchasing, Carlos from quality control. We'd watched each other's kids grow up, attended weddings, helped each other move houses, comforted each other after funerals. The company didn't just feel like work, it felt like part of my life. Then everything changed when our founder retired. The board hired a new CEO named Daniel Mercer. Daniel was younger than most department managers. Sharp suit, perfect smile, MBA from an expensive university. He talked endlessly about transformation, optimization, efficiency, leveraging talent. Every meeting sounded like someone had swallowed a business textbook. At first, I figured he'd settle in. Every new executive wants to leave a mark. I understood that. But Daniel wasn't interested in understanding why things worked. He only wanted to prove he could do them differently. Within months, experienced managers started disappearing. Some retired earlier than planned. Some accepted jobs elsewhere. Others were quietly let go. Each time Daniel gave the same explanation. We're building a more agile organization. It sounded impressive. Until you realized agile usually meant replacing people who knew the business with people who looked better on spreadsheets. I stayed out of it. My projects kept succeeding. Customers kept renewing contracts. My team's numbers remained among the strongest in the company. I figured results would protect me. I couldn't have been more wrong. The first sign came during an executive review meeting. Daniel interrupted my presentation halfway through. "Arthur," he said with a smile that somehow felt insulting, "your technical knowledge is exceptional." I thanked him. Then he continued, "But leadership today isn't just about fixing machines. It's about vision. I wasn't sure what that meant. Neither was anyone else in the room. He clicked to another slide. We need leaders who embrace change instead of relying on outdated methods. Outdated methods? Our customer satisfaction rating had just reached its highest level in company history. Our projects finished ahead of schedule. Warranty claims were down nearly 30%. I politely asked which specific methods concerned him. He smiled again. If you have to ask, you're proving my point. A few people chuckled nervously. I didn't. After the meeting, Mike caught up with me in the parking lot. What was that about? I honestly don't know. He keeps doing that, Mike muttered. Makes people feel like they're behind without ever saying what they're doing wrong. Over the next several months, things became stranger. I was left out of meetings I'd attended for years. Major accounts were reassigned without explanation. Young managers with almost no field experience suddenly started reviewing my work. One of them asked me why our installation teams carried backup circuit boards. I blinked. Because components fail, he frowned, but failure rates are statistically low. Exactly, I said. That's why customers hire us. Because when something does fail, we already have the replacement. He typed something into his tablet. I'll note your resistance to inventory optimization. Resistance? I was explaining basic customer service. When I got home that evening, my wife, Emily, immediately knew something was bothering me. You've been quiet all week. I shrugged. Just work. She poured 2 cups of coffee and sat beside me on the back porch. You've said just work every night for a month. I looked across the yard where our old golden retriever was lazily chasing squirrels he had no chance of catching. I don't recognize the place anymore. She didn't try to solve it. She simply reached over and squeezed my hand. You've built your reputation for 18 years, she said softly. No one can erase that. I wanted to believe her. Looking back, that conversation hurts the most. 'Cause neither of us realized the decision had already been made. And someone inside the company had been helping make sure I never saw it coming. The first clue that something was happening behind my back came from someone who wasn't supposed to tell me anything. Linda. She had worked in purchasing for almost 25 years and had seen more executive shakeups than anyone else I knew. Normally, she never discussed internal management decisions. That afternoon, she stopped by my office carrying a stack of purchase approvals. She closed the door behind her. Arthur, her voice was unusually quiet. Can I ask you something? Sure. Has Daniel talked to you about retirement? I laughed. I'm 45. I know. So, no. She hesitated. I wasn't supposed to see it. See what? There was a workforce planning document. I frowned. What kind of document? I only saw it for a second before they took it away. She looked genuinely uncomfortable. But your department was highlighted. My stomach tightened. What did it say? I don't remember every detail. She paused. But I remember one sentence. She looked directly at me. Legacy employees with above-market compensation present an opportunity for organizational restructuring. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Legacy employees, that was me. Not project supervisor. Not technical lead. Not someone who had helped build the company. Just an expensive line on a spreadsheet. Linda sighed. I probably shouldn't have told you. I'm glad you did. I just wanted you to know. As she left, she quietly added one more sentence. Watch your back. From that day forward, I started noticing things I'd ignored before. Every mistake, no matter how small, was suddenly documented. If another team missed a deadline, nothing happened. If my team finished one day late, because a customer changed specifications. I received an email asking for a written explanation. Expenses that had been approved for years suddenly required additional authorization. Travel requests sat unanswered for days. Even customer compliments stopped being forwarded to my department. Mike noticed it too. They're building a file. A file? So if they fire you, they'll have paperwork. I wanted to argue. Instead, I realized he was probably right. Then came the meeting. It appeared on my calendar with almost no notice. Performance review. That was strange. My annual review wasn't due for another 5 months. When I walked into the conference room, Daniel was already there. So was Karen from Human Resources. Neither of them smiled. Daniel folded his hands. Arthur, thank you for coming. Whenever someone thanks you before saying something unpleasant, you know what's coming. He opened a folder. We've identified several concerns regarding your adaptability. I blinked. My adaptability? Yes. He slid several printed emails across the table. I recognized them immediately. Everyone had been taken completely out of context. One email where I'd recommended carrying spare parts. Another where I'd questioned an unrealistic project deadline. A third where I'd explained why removing quality inspections would increase warranty costs. Daniel tapped the papers. These demonstrate resistance to operational modernization. I stared at him. No. He tilted his head. No. They demonstrate engineering. Karen shifted uncomfortably. I continued. If a customer loses production because we saved $200 on spare parts, they'll never buy from us again. Daniel leaned back. That mindset is exactly what concerns leadership. I took a slow breath. My customers have renewed contracts for years because we prevent problems. Our future strategy differs. It ignores reality. The room became very quiet. Karen looked down at her notes. Daniel smiled again, except this time, it wasn't friendly. I appreciate your honesty. I already knew that sentence wasn't good. For the next 2 weeks, I wasn't assigned a single new project. My calendar emptied. People stopped asking for my opinion. I wasn't invited to planning meetings. It was as if I had already left. Only nobody had told me yet. One afternoon, Carlos stopped by. You okay? I think so. They asked me if I'd be interested in supervising your team. I stared at him. When? This morning. And? I told them. No. Why? He shrugged. Because you're still my boss. That meant more than I could explain. Friday morning arrived. 9:15 a.m. A calendar notification. Please report to Executive Conference Room B. No agenda. No explanation. I walked down the hallway feeling strangely calm, almost peaceful. Maybe because deep down, I already knew. Karen was there again. Daniel sat at the far end of the table. A cardboard box rested on the floor beside my chair. That told me everything. Karen began reading from a prepared document. As part of an organizational restructuring, I barely heard the rest. Words blurred together. Position eliminated. Effective immediately. Transition assistance. Benefits. When she finished, Daniel finally spoke. This isn't personal. I almost laughed. You've spent 8 months making it personal. His expression didn't change. The company is moving in a different direction. I nodded slowly. So who takes over my customers? We've reassigned responsibilities. To people who've never managed those installations, we're confident in the transition. I looked directly at him. No. He frowned. No? You're confident in the spreadsheet. Silence. Then Daniel stood. I think this meeting has concluded. That was it. 18 years, less than 10 minutes. No thank you, no recognition, no handshake, nothing. Karen quietly slid separation documents toward me. I signed them without reading. Not because I trusted them, because I no longer cared. Walking back to my office was harder than the meeting itself. People pretended to work. Nobody wanted to make eye contact. Mike stood before I reached my desk. "I'm sorry." He looked furious, not emotional, angry. "They're making a mistake. I know." He helped me pack family photos, coffee mug, a notebook full of project sketches, an old company jacket I'd worn for nearly 15 winters. When we reached the parking lot, he hugged me. Neither of us said much. Sometimes there aren't words. I drove home in complete silence. Emily met me at the front door before I even reached for my keys. She looked at the box, then at my face. "They did it." I nodded. She wrapped both arms around me. For the first time all day, I let myself feel it. Not anger, not humiliation, just grief. Because I wasn't mourning a paycheck. I was mourning 18 years of believing loyalty actually mattered. That night, after Emily went to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen staring at my old company ID badge. I almost threw it away. Instead, I opened my laptop, not to look for another job, to answer an email I'd ignored for nearly 6 months. An email from someone I'd met years earlier, who had once told me, "If you ever decide you're ready, call me first." Back then, I'd politely declined. This time, I picked up the phone, and everything began to change. The email had come from a man named David Chen. I first met David almost 8 years earlier during a nightmare installation at an automotive parts plant outside Columbus. His production line had gone down just 48 hours before a major shipment deadline. Every hour of downtime was costing his company tens of thousands of dollars. Our competitors had already told him the repair would take at least 4 days. My team and I had it running before sunrise. Not because we were miracle workers, because we listened. One of David's engineers mentioned hearing a clicking sound just before the failure. That tiny detail pointed me toward a damaged controller instead of the much larger system everyone else was blaming. When the line started moving again, David shook my hand and said, "If you ever leave Harrison, don't disappear." I smiled and thanked him. I never imagined I'd actually call him. He answered on the second ring. "Arthur, I hope I'm not calling too late." "It's never too late for you." There was a brief pause. "You left Harrison. It wasn't a question." "How'd you know?" "I heard." News traveled fast in our industry, especially when someone had spent 18 years building relationships. David didn't ask why I'd been fired. He asked something much more interesting. "What do you want to do next?" I hadn't thought about it that way. Everyone else had asked what job I wanted. David asked what I wanted. "I honestly don't know." "You still enjoy solving problems?" "Absolutely." "You still hate corporate nonsense?" I laughed for the first time in days. "More than ever." "Good, good." He laughed too. "Then maybe it's time you stopped making someone else rich." A week later, Emily and I drove to meet him. Not at a corporate office, at a renovated warehouse that had been turned into a modern engineering workspace. It wasn't flashy. There were no marble floors, no giant executive portraits, just engineers, technicians, prototype equipment, and people who actually seemed happy to be there. David had become a partner in a rapidly growing industrial consulting company. Instead of selling equipment, they helped manufacturers fix efficiency problems, recover failing projects, and modernize existing systems without wasting millions replacing everything. "We're small," David admitted. "But we're growing." He looked around the shop floor. I need someone customers already trust. I've never sold consulting. I know. So why me? Because customers don't buy consulting. He smiled. They buy confidence. The conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. Nobody asked why I'd been fired. Nobody questioned my age. Nobody suggested my experience was outdated. Instead, they asked things like, how would you approach this production bottleneck? What mistakes do large manufacturers keep repeating? What do customers complain about that nobody listens to? For the first time in months, someone wanted my opinion. When we left, Emily looked over from the passenger seat. They respect you. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed that feeling. David called the next morning. We'd like to make you an offer. It wasn't just more money than I'd been making. It included profit sharing, flexible scheduling, and something I'd never had before, the freedom to tell clients the truth, even if it wasn't the most profitable answer. I accepted before he finished explaining the benefits. The next several months became the busiest period of my career. Instead of managing one company's projects, I worked with dozens. Every week brought a different challenge. A food processing plant with constant conveyor failures. A packaging company losing millions because of unnecessary downtime. A plastics manufacturer replacing expensive equipment that didn't actually need replacing. Again and again, the solution wasn't buying more machines. It was understanding the people already using them. Word spread surprisingly fast. Clients began requesting me by name, not because I had the fanciest presentations, because I spoke plainly. If something didn't need replacing, I said so. If management was creating its own problems, I said that too. Sometimes they didn't like hearing it, but they respected it. David once joked, "You have the strange ability to make executives uncomfortable while convincing them to hire us again." I took that as a compliment. About 5 months after joining the company, David stopped by my office carrying a folder. "You've heard of Apex Manufacturing Group?" Of course. One of the largest industrial operators in the region. They've asked us to submit a proposal. I opened the folder. Inside were dozens of facilities, hundreds of employees, and one enormous modernization project. "This is huge." "It is." I looked at him. "So why do I feel like there's bad news?" He smiled. "'Cause there's one detail." "What?" David slid another page across the desk. My eyes stopped on a familiar company logo, Harrison Industrial Systems. I looked up slowly. "What am I looking at?" "Apex wants outside consultants." "For what?" "They're evaluating every major supplier." I read further. Harrison wasn't Apex's customer. Harrison was competing for a contract worth tens of millions of dollars. And Apex wanted an independent technical evaluation before making its final decision. David folded his arms. "They specifically requested you." I stared at him. "Me?" "They've heard your name from 3 different plant managers. They know I worked at Harrison." "They do." I leaned back in my chair. "And they still asked for me." David nodded. "They said they wanted someone who couldn't be influenced." The irony almost made me laugh. The company that had treated me like I was obsolete might lose one of the biggest contracts in its history because another company trusted my judgment more than Harrison's own leadership. 2 weeks later, we arrived at Apex headquarters for the preliminary meetings. Their executive team welcomed us warmly. They'd already reviewed our previous work. The morning went smoothly. We discussed production targets, maintenance costs, equipment reliability, risk analysis. Everything felt normal until shortly after lunch. One of Apex's vice presidents glanced toward the conference room door. "They're here." "Who?" the supplier representatives. The door opened. 3 people walked inside. I recognized the first immediately, Daniel Mercer. He was talking confidently until he saw me. He stopped mid-sentence. His smile disappeared. For a moment, the room went completely silent. I simply stood, calmly, professionally. "Good afternoon, Daniel." He looked like he'd seen a ghost, because the man he'd dismissed with a cardboard box was no longer sitting on the other side of the table. This time, we were equals, and before the day was over, he was going to realize that wasn't even the biggest surprise waiting for him. For a second, neither of us moved. Daniel recovered first. "Arthur." He forced a smile and walked over with his hand extended. "It's been a while." I shook it. "About 5 months. You look well. So do you." It was the kind of conversation people have when everyone in the room knows there's a much bigger one they aren't having. The vice president from Apex broke the tension. "Looks like you two already know each other." Daniel answered before I could. "Arthur was one of our project supervisors for many years." Was. Interesting choice of words. I smiled politely. "I spent 18 years there." The vice president looked impressed. 18? That's right. Daniel quickly redirected the conversation. "Arthur knows our products very well." "I do," I replied. "And I also know where they're excellent." I paused just long enough. "And where they need improvement." Daniel's expression barely changed, but I noticed it. He hadn't expected that answer. The afternoon was devoted to technical presentations. Each supplier had 90 minutes to explain why Apex should trust them with a modernization project spread across 6 manufacturing plants. Daniel delivered exactly the presentation I expected. Beautiful slides, polished graphics, buzzwords everywhere: artificial intelligence, digital transformation, predictive optimization, operational synergy. Everything sounded impressive until the questions started. One Apex executive asked, "How will your proposed inventory reductions affect emergency repairs?" Daniel smiled confidently. "Our analytics indicate those failures are statistically insignificant." I looked down at my notes. I'd heard almost those exact words before. Another executive spoke. "What happens if a controller fails on a weekend?" Daniel answered, "Replacement parts can typically arrive within 24 hours. The maintenance director frowned. "Our facilities lose nearly $80,000 per hour during an outage." Silence. 24 hours suddenly sounded much longer. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "We're confident our reliability models minimize that risk." The maintenance director nodded politely, but I could already tell he wasn't convinced. After every supplier finished, Apex invited our consulting team into a separate conference room. Our job wasn't to choose a winner. It was to evaluate risk. David opened the discussion. "Let's go one supplier at a time." We reviewed technical specifications, support capabilities, training programs, maintenance history, financial stability. Nobody mentioned personalities. Nobody cared who gave the nicest presentation. Only evidence mattered. When Harrison's turn came, everyone looked toward me. I took a slow breath. I want to be clear about something. The room stayed quiet. I worked there for 18 years. Several executives nodded. I also care deeply about many people who still work there. Another nod. My opinion today has nothing to do with how my employment ended. The vice president leaned forward. We expected nothing less. I appreciated that. So I opened my notebook. Harrison still employs some of the best engineers I've ever worked with. I meant every word. The field technicians are outstanding. outstanding. Also true. The quality department remains excellent. Again, true. David watched me carefully. Then I continued. But that single word changed the room. The executive strategy presented today does not match operational reality. I spent nearly 40 minutes explaining why, not emotionally, technically, the inventory reductions, the removal of experienced field personnel, the increased dependence on centralized logistics, the shortened installation schedules. Every recommendation was backed by numbers. Every concern included documentation. No exaggeration, no revenge, just facts. When I finished, nobody spoke immediately. Finally, the maintenance director asked one question. If this were your project, he paused. Would you approve Harrison's current proposal? I didn't answer right away, because as I understood exactly how important the next sentence would be. No. Not because they lacked capable employees, because leadership had created unnecessary operational risk. The meeting ended late that afternoon. As people gathered their papers, Daniel approached me outside the conference room. Can we talk? I looked at David. He gave a small nod. 5 minutes. Daniel led me into a quiet hallway overlooking the parking lot. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, he sighed. I didn't expect to see you here. I imagine not. You've done well. I've been fortunate. He leaned against the window. I've heard good things. I'm glad. Another silence. Then his tone changed. You were tough in there. I was honest. You know how these evaluations work. I do. You could have been more balanced. That surprised me. I praised your engineers. You criticized leadership, because that's what the evidence supported. His jaw tightened. You know those recommendations came from the executive team. I know. So you understand the position you're putting us in. I looked directly at him. No. He frowned. No? I understand the position your decisions put your employees in. He didn't respond, so I continued. When experienced technicians warned you about inventory reductions, you ignored them. When project managers questioned unrealistic schedules, you ignored them. When customers asked for more field support, you reduced staffing. Daniel looked away. You always think everything is simple. No. I think accountability is simple. Before either of us could say another word, someone called Daniel's name. One of Harrison's sales directors hurried down on the hallway. There you are. He stopped when he saw me. Oh. His expression became awkward. We need you. Daniel nodded. I'll be there. As they walked away, I heard the sales director whisper, how much influence does he actually have? Daniel answered quietly, I don't know. Neither of them realized they were asking the wrong question. Because this project wasn't the only reason Apex wanted to work with our company. And the next morning, a confidential meeting was scheduled, one that Daniel hadn't been invited to. A meeting where I was about to discover that someone had been quietly watching my career for far longer than I ever realized. The invitation arrived in my inbox just before 7:00 a.m. confidential executive session. No agenda. No list of attendees beyond a handful of Apex executives, David and me. When I walked into the boardroom, I immediately noticed something different. The atmosphere wasn't tense. It was focused. Coffee cups sat untouched. Folders were already open. Someone had been preparing for this meeting long before yesterday's presentations. The vice president smiled. Morning, Arthur. Good morning. Thanks for coming in early. No problem. As soon as everyone was seated, he closed the door. What we're about to discuss stays in this room. Everyone nodded. Then he looked directly at me. I owe you an explanation. I waited. For the last 3 years, we've been tracking supplier performance across every facility we own. He slid a report across the table. It contained hundreds of pages of maintenance records, service response times, warranty claims, and customer satisfaction surveys. Harrison used to be our highest-rated supplier. I wasn't surprised. They aren't anymore. I slowly turned another page. The decline wasn't dramatic at first. Then, about a year earlier, everything changed. Longer response times, higher equipment downtime, more emergency service calls, more customer complaints. The timeline matched Daniel's arrival almost exactly. The vice president continued. We couldn't understand why. He looked at me. Until we started interviewing plant managers. Several of them had left comments in the report. Experienced supervisors disappeared. Field decisions now require corporate approval. Support feels disconnected from reality. The people who understood our operations are gone. I recognized the pattern immediately. The executives at Harrison had been measuring success through quarterly reports. Their customers were measuring it by whether production lines stayed running. Those weren't the same thing anymore. Then came the part I never saw coming. The vice president folded his hands. Arthur, do you know why your name kept appearing? I shook my head. Because every plant manager who'd worked with you said almost the same thing. He opened another folder. Inside were interview summaries. One manager had said, Arthur never sold us what we didn't need. Another wrote, if Arthur said something would work, it worked. A third comment made me stop reading. When Arthur left Harrison, we assumed the company had made a serious mistake. I looked up. The room was completely quiet. David smiled. I told you. I swallowed hard. It wasn't pride I felt. It was something closer to validation. For months I'd questioned myself, wondered whether I'd somehow become outdated, whether Daniel had been right. Now I had my answer. The vice president leaned forward. We have another question. Go ahead. If Apex awards this modernization project to your firm, he paused. Would you be willing to lead it? I looked at David. He already seemed to know what my answer would be. It's a huge responsibility. We know. It would require building teams across 6 facilities. We know. It'll take at least 2 years. We know. I smiled. Then yes. The entire room relaxed. One executive even laughed. We were hoping you'd say that. Around lunchtime, all suppliers were invited back for the final debrief. Nobody expected a decision that day. These projects usually took weeks. Instead, the Apex president stood at the front of the room. Thank you all for your proposals. He thanked each company for participating. Then he announced that Apex had selected a consulting partner to oversee the modernization strategy. Our company, not Harrison. Ours. The room filled with polite applause. I glanced toward Daniel. His expression never changed, but I could tell he hadn't expected the announcement. Then the Apex president added something unexpected. We'd also like to recognize one individual. I felt every eye in the room shift. Throughout this evaluation, one consultant demonstrated exceptional technical integrity. I already knew where this was going, and honestly, I wished it wasn't public. Arthur Vale. He smiled at me. Your recommendations consistently placed long-term operational success above short-term financial appearances. I stood as people applauded. It was uncomfortable. I've never liked being the center of attention. The president continued. That kind of professional reputation cannot be manufactured. He looked around the room. It has to be earned. For 18 years, one decision at a time. After the meeting ended, I gathered my notebook and prepared to leave. Someone called my name. It was Daniel. He looked different than he had yesterday, less confident, more tired. "Do you have a minute?" "Sure." We walked outside into the warm afternoon. Neither of us spoke until we reached the parking lot. Finally, he stopped. "I owe you an apology." I said nothing. "I handled your departure poorly." I appreciated the honesty, but I also noticed something. He hadn't apologized for firing me, only for how he'd done it. "I've spent telling myself it was just business," he admitted. "I know. But yesterday," he looked down. "Hearing plant managers repeat your name," his voice trailed off. "I didn't realize how much trust you'd built." I answered quietly. "That's because trust doesn't show up on quarterly reports." He gave a small, defeated smile. "No, it doesn't." For a moment we simply stood there. Then he asked the question I'd been expecting since yesterday. "Is there anything I can do?" I thought carefully before answering. "There is." He looked hopeful. "Start listening to the people who've spent years solving problems." He nodded slowly. "They're smarter than you think." I know that now. I wasn't sure he truly did. But for the first time, I believed he wanted to. A week after the Apex announcement, my phone rang. The caller ID said Mike. I answered before the second ring. "How are things over there?" He let out a tired laugh. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Try me." The board called an emergency meeting 2 days after Apex made its decision. That got my attention, and they've been asking a lot of questions. What kind of questions? Why experienced employees kept leaving. I stayed quiet. Why customer satisfaction has dropped. Another pause. And why nobody inside management seemed willing to admit there was a problem. None of that surprised me. Eventually, numbers catch up with decisions. You can ignore warning signs for a while. You can't ignore consequences forever. Mike continued. "They're bringing in outside auditors. For Apex. For everything." Over the next several months, our team got to work. The Apex project was enormous. 6 facilities, hundreds of employees, thousands of pieces of equipment. But instead of arriving with a list of expensive upgrades, we started by asking questions. What keeps breaking? What slows you down? What have you been trying to tell management? The answers almost always came from the people on the factory floor. Maintenance technicians, machine operators, electricians, supervisors, the people who lived with those systems every day. One afternoon, a mechanic named Ron pointed at a conveyor that had been causing problems for years. "They've spent $2 million trying to fix that." I asked him what he thought. He shrugged. "They're replacing the wrong part." We tested his idea. He was right. The permanent solution cost less than $20,000. David laughed when he saw the final report. "You know what our secret is?" I smiled. "We listen." Exactly. The project finished ahead of schedule. Equipment downtime dropped. Production increased. Emergency repairs fell dramatically. Most importantly, the employees finally felt heard. At the closing meeting, one plant manager shook my hand. "You know why people trust you?" I shrugged. "No idea. Because you never walk into a room acting like you're the smartest person in it." That stayed with me. A few months later, I received another call from Mike. This one sounded different. "It's official." "What is?" Daniel resigned. I leaned back in my chair. "I see. The board accepted it yesterday." I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel victorious. If anything, I felt a little sad. Because despite everything, I never wanted anyone to fail. I only wanted people to stop confusing confidence with competence. Before hanging up, Mike added one more thing. They've started bringing experienced people back. Really? Yeah. A lot of them left because they felt ignored. I smiled. Maybe someone finally listened. Not long after that, I ran into Daniel one last time. It wasn't in a boardroom or a conference center. It was at a local charity event raising money for vocational education programs. He was standing alone near a display of student engineering projects. He noticed me and smiled, a genuine smile this time. No conference table between us today. No. We shook hands. He looked lighter, less like someone trying to prove something. I took your advice, he said. Oh, I've been consulting with smaller manufacturers. How's that going? They ask a lot of questions. I laughed. They usually do. And I spend a lot more time listening now. I hope so. He nodded. I didn't understand what I'd lost. What do you mean? I kept thinking leadership meant having the answers. He looked across the room at a group of students gathered around a robotics display. It turns out leadership starts with admitting someone else might. That was probably the wisest sentence I'd ever heard him say. We talked for another 10 minutes, not as former boss and former employee, just two professionals who had learned different lessons the hard way. When we parted, there was no anger left, no score to settle, just respect, the kind that's earned. People sometimes ask whether losing my job was the worst day of my life. For a long time, I said yes. Now, I don't think that's true. The worst day wasn't when I carried that cardboard box to my car. The worst day would have been staying somewhere that no longer valued honesty, experience, or the people doing the real work. Getting fired felt like losing everything. In reality, it forced me to discover what no paycheck had ever shown me. My reputation had never belonged to a company. It belonged to me. A title can be taken away. An office can disappear. A business card can become meaningless overnight. But if you've spent years treating people fairly, keeping your promises, owning your mistakes, and solving problems instead of chasing credit, those things follow you long after your employee badge stops working. When Daniel fired me after 18 years, he believed he was letting go of an aging manager who no longer fit the future. What he actually let go of was something far more valuable: trust. And once trust walks out the door, no spreadsheet in the world can replace it. If there's one lesson I carried away from all of this, it's simple. Never build your identity around the company you work for. Build it around the kind of person you choose to be every single day. Because one day, someone may decide they no longer need your position, but if you've earned people's respect, they'll never forget your name.